Thanks. Thank you, David. That was so generous. We thought we would start this afternoon with a little story before we get into conversation. And I thought I would start by telling you the mindset culture origin story. So it's 2005, and I'm a PhD student at Stanford. And what's traditional is that PhD students present their research at the end of the year to the faculty members, in different seminar series. And so I'm sitting in the audience listening to my friend, there to support my friend in the 4th year of the PhD program. And he's up there, he's presenting his life's work. And all of a sudden, in the middle of his talk, this professor on the right doesn't raise his hand, he just shouts out, "Well, it's clear the fatal flaw is ABC." And then on the left, another professor shouts out, "No, the fatal flaw isn't ABC, it is XYZ. And if he doesn't solve that problem, there's really no point in the work that he's doing." And I saw what it was doing to my friend. These faculty fighting to show who was the smartest in the room, who could take down his ideas the quickest with the most devastating comment. What did it do to him? He lost focus. He wasn't able to participate in answering the questions. And more importantly, weeks later, he didn't want to pick up his work again because the thought of doing so was so painful given the context that he just experienced. 2 weeks later, I was in a different seminar, and now faculty, equally eminent, are approaching the student talks in a totally different way. They're still finding the problems of the talk, but they're instead of fighting to see who's the smartest in the room, now they're arguing amongst each other about how to improve the project the best way possible. So they're saying, maybe should include this measure, work with this different population, all of these different ideas. And how did it affect the students? The students were actually able to participate in the questions, brainstorming with the faculty members. And they left motivated and ready to put those strategies that they just received into action to make their project better. And I was sitting there thinking about these two different environments that really hold at the core of them different mindsets. I thought, wow, this isn't just about mindset in the head. What's your mindset? How does it affect you? What's my mindset? How does it affect me? It's about these contexts and the powerful people within them. Maybe it's about mindset culture. So I take this idea that I have down the hallway to Carol Dweck, who had just arrived from Columbia University to Stanford. I knock on her door, and I say, "Carol, I know for 20 years we've been studying mindset as a quality of our own beliefs in our head, but maybe that's not enough. Maybe mindset actually exists as a cultural factor in what we say and do and how we actually interact with each other." How did Carol respond to this proclamation that a big hole was missing in the mindset work? Did she respond from her fixed or from her growth mindset? Well, we can ask her today. Don't take my word for it. It is my pleasure to introduce the originator of the idea of the fixed and growth mindset, my mentor, my collaborator, my dear friend. Join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Carol Dweck.
That is such an interesting question. How did I respond? Well, there are two parts to that story. The first part was before Mary entered the office while she was still knocking on the door. We had studied mindsets for a while, dozens and dozens of studies. We did find some students leaned more towards a fixed mindset, the idea that your intelligence, your abilities are just fixed. You have a certain amount and that's it. Whereas others lean more towards a growth mindset, the idea that you could develop your abilities through effort, but not just effort, learning good strategies, seeking lots of input, help, advice, mentoring from others. We also found, by the way, it's a continuum, it's not an either or. And by the way, we then learned that even if you're usually in a growth mindset, you can be triggered into a fixed mindset. Like those students in the first example, they went into a feeling that their ability was fixed and limited, although I hope it was temporary. Anyway, we also found that these mindsets could create a whole psychological world where everything has a different meaning. We call this meaning systems. In the fixed mindset, a challenge is something threatening. You could reveal yourself to be inadequate. In a growth mindset, wait a minute, learning is the way to grow challenges are the way to grow your abilities. In a fixed mindset, effort is dangerous. If you have to work too hard, you're obviously not good at something. But in a growth mindset, effort is one of the main ways, along with strategies and help, support, to grow your abilities. And finally, in a fixed mindset, mistakes and setbacks. Hold the mic closer, okay. In a fixed mindset, effort, setbacks, and heaven forbid, failures are the final verdict. It's fixed and you don't have it. But in a growth mindset, setbacks, even failures, are part of learning, and they need to be mined for information about how to learn what to do next. We also started finding in studies that if we assess students' mindsets at the beginning of a difficult transition, the mindsets predicted their grades across those transitions. We and others also started creating carefully developed mindset programs, which then, again, across challenging transitions, led to higher grades. We were pretty satisfied. Then Mary came along.
The end of satisfaction.
And she said, well, I like your work, you're finding a lot of good things, but, mindset isn't just a belief that lives in people's heads that they cart around with them from place to place. A mindset, a culture, a setting, a classroom, an organization can also have a mindset. The people in it can be kind of encoded in the DNA of the organization. In a fixed mindset culture of genius, people believe in fixed ability and they worship it. They create hierarchies from it. But in a growth mindset setting, the culture of growth, the idea is that everyone's ability can be developed, and we are devoted to that. That's what we are about. Now, I realized this incredible insight had so many ramifications. One was a student can arrive in a classroom with a very strong growth mindset, but maybe they can't use it because making mistakes in that classroom is humiliating. Showing that you're confused means confronting the teacher with maybe the idea that it wasn't taught to everybody yet. Getting a low grade on the test, you see it seems to confirm that you're a low achiever. So this insight, the individual's mindset, the culture's mindset, this insight was the other part of the answer. And by the way, Mary, what did I say?
You said, Mayor, No one's ever considered this. But we should do it, and we should do it together. Let's go. And then we did our first study.
Yes. Okay. So, if this idea of yours proved valid, which it has, what does this mean? What does this mean for teachers, for example?
Yeah, it means, I think, that we can no longer just think that it's enough to give students a growth mindset, right? And leave it all up to them. Put the burden on students or put the burden on employees and say, just change your mind. Have a growth mindset, or just receive these programs that really embody the growth mindset and help them understand how to actually make those mindsets real. Because if they come into these fixed-minded contexts, these cultures of genius, right, they will be unlikely to be able to use or benefit from those growth mindsets. So it became known, even in our data, we were seeing that this was true. In the national study of mindsets, we had David Yeager pioneering this study. Carol and I collaborated on it. And in this study, it was the randomized control trial, gold standard kind of methods, and these growth mindset programs, carefully developed, were delivered across the nation in a nationally representative sample of more than 12,000 students, 6,000 of whom got the growth mindset program. And lo and behold, we found it did increase grades. It also increased difficult course taking, where students were more willing to sign up for those difficult STEM courses in high school. However, we also studied where it wouldn't work. And what did we find? We found teachers. We basically found that when teachers had more fixed mindset beliefs or were engaged in fixed-minded practices, the effect of the student-level program, their ability to use that new growth mindset, was zero, literally zero. Only when the teachers had a growth mindset or engaged in growth-minded practices did we see the impact of the program actually benefiting students in terms of their grades and their other outcomes. So that became really important for us. We started to see that the target of intervention needed to not just be the students. It needed to be about teachers. We needed to understand the strategies and the ways in which we could help teachers learn to create these cultures of growth that would really allow students' growth mindsets to take root and to be useful to them.
Yes, and the study worked. It helped a lot of people just doing it at the individual level. We could have declared victory and gone home. But no, as Mary's saying, we cared deeply about where it didn't work, and we committed ourselves, based on Mary's work, to find out how to make it work everywhere.
So Carol, one of the stories, right when we were at the very beginning of talking about this possibility of mindset culture, you shared with me a story about a situation in your own schooling experience where you encountered a really strong, fixed-minded culture of genius. Will you share it with everybody here?
I will. I grew up in the era, in the heyday of IQ testing and the worship of the IQ score. But my sixth grade teacher, Mrs. Wilson, took this to the nth degree, the most extreme level possible. She even seated us around the room in IQ order. It was already the highest IQ class in the school, but she thought further gradations were very necessary, very meaningful. And she thought the IQ just captured everything important about you. She would only let the highest IQ students do such amazing things like wash the blackboard or carry a note to the school principal. Now, I had always been a lover of learning, a taker-on of challenges. But in this classroom, I transformed into someone who was afraid of challenges, afraid of mistakes, afraid of things that were hard, because I didn't want to lose my seat. So it made the students who were in the poor seats feel bad. It made the students in the good seats, didn't buoy them up. It made them feel afraid of everything that feeds true learning.
And what did it do when there was a new person?
One day, the door of the classroom opened, and the principal ushered in a new girl who had just moved to the school district. And my first thought was, oh, she looks really nice, another friend. But my next thought was, she better not take my seat. And so this kind of fearful, competitive, begrudging attitude in place of this very warm and welcoming one I felt more naturally.
It reminds me a lot of the work we did years later around the founders and the entrepreneurs. I don't know if you remember this
The
study.
startup study.
Right, exactly. So we worked with hundreds of entrepreneurs, early stage companies, and we measured the mindsets of the entrepreneurs. And we found that the fixed mindset founders who were creating their policies, figuring out who to hire, do you remember?
I do. Do you want to say it?
You say it.
I'll say it. More than the growth mindset founders, they agreed that they didn't want anyone smarter than they were in their organization.
And yet they wanted to have the most innovation, the most creativity. They were on the line trying to raise funding to support these early stage organizations, but the priority was to be sure to not hire anyone smarter than me.
Good luck with that.
Right, exactly. So how about cultures of growth, Carol? Do you feel like there are situations where you can just walk into a context and feel what a culture of growth actually feels like and experiences? Do you have any examples?
I have a beautiful example. Some years ago, I went to give a talk at a very large financial organization in Chicago. As I approached the skyscraper, I thought, this is going to be a very buttoned-up group, very serious, probably very fixed mindset, if I may use that term. Okay, so I get to the door. The doorman opens the door and waves my book at me. Welcome, Professor Dweck. We're so excited to have you here today. I think, what? They didn't just get the book for the bigwigs, the finance people. They got my book for everybody. And he kind of proudly ushers me over to the receptionist. And the receptionist said, Professor Dweck, I cannot wait to hear your talk. We're really excited about it. Whoa, I thought. The talk is not just for the finance people, it's for everybody. And then I saw these sign-up sheets all around the lobby. I said, what's that? And they said, these are sign-up sheets for special projects that anyone in the organization can sign up for and be a real part of. I thought, oh my goodness, everyone was so excited to be here, so central to everyone, so proud of their organization, and so knowing that their organization believed in them and felt that they could really contribute to these projects.
Amazing. It reminds me, we did a summer institute for several years with kindergarten through 6th grade teachers. And they would come in for a week in the summer and they'd learn how to adopt these growth-minded practices to the things they're already doing in class. Not extra, but how to actually create these cultures of growth. And then a year later, we went with cameras to sort of look and see whether or not these practices were still being put in place. Did they fade out, or were teachers actually using them in their day-to-day interactions with students? And I will never forget the classroom in Washington State where we went in, and the kids are sitting in the circle, and they're singing their morning song, and they're talking about how excited they are to grow their brain for 8 hours. They were talking about how they were not going to leave each other behind in their learning. They talked about can't wait for the mistakes and challenges of today. And then as we looked at the walls, even the walls, the way the teacher had the work displayed on the walls signaled that we were in a culture of growth. There was the early work from the very beginning of the year where kids hadn't even learned to write the letter A, to how it was now, right? Writing their full name so that kids could see for themselves their progress in their learning and development. I thought, this is permeating the entire context. And there's no way to be a student here without getting excited about learning.
I know, and to watch how engaged and excited the kids were, not just in the morning song, but in their learning. It was so inspiring.
Transformative. It was great. So, I think we should give people a sense of what these classrooms sound like. I know we brought some quotes because it feels like quotes are some of the things that people can really get a sense of the stories of how teachers who are engaged in some of this culture of growth work, what does it look like and sound like from the teacher or educational leader perspective?
Absolutely. And this is from a study by Cameron Hecht, Chris Bryan, David Yeager, and they gave teachers sample quotes that they could make their own or write their own, modeled on this. The teachers said these things at strategic points, at the beginning of the year, before or after a test, and these never fail to move me. I don't care how much you know. I don't care about how much you know right now. I care about how much you've learned by the end of the year. And as long as you put in the work, I'll be here to help you make sure that work pays off. Where you start out isn't important to me. What matters to me is that each of you makes major progress, more than you probably think you can make. Tests are just indicators of what students know right now. I want to see that you're learning and becoming confident with the material. Tests help me see where you're at and how I can help you to improve beyond that place.
Yeah, incredible. And then what we saw in this study was that students, when they are in the classrooms of teachers who are really building these cultures of growth, they are way more likely to respond to questions like, in the affirmative, like, my teacher believes everyone in my class can be good at this subject. Or, my math teacher respects all students, even the ones who are struggling in their work. And students in my math class feel comfortable raising their hand to ask a question when they're confused. And in this work and in so much other work that we've done, we've seen that these effects are beneficial for everyone. All the students are experiencing this kind of more motivating context where people are willing to raise their hand, ask a question, make a mistake. But the impact of these growth mindset cultures are even more powerful for students who are often stereotyped as not having innate, natural talent, ability, and intelligence. Students from structurally disadvantaged groups and underrepresented groups, over and over, we see that the benefits of these cultures of growth accrue to everyone, and even more so for these underrepresented students. And so it has an equity and inclusive nature to creating these cultures of growth relative to the more fixed-minded cultures of genius.
Mary, I found so many things in your book intriguing and transformative. One of the things that intrigued me was when you talked about how people often misunderstand the culture of growth. Can you talk about that?
Yes. So I think there's at least a couple of ways that I have seen people misunderstand cultures of growth. The first one is really thinking that these cultures of growth are just coddling right? They're just soft, endlessly affirming, rainbows and unicorns all day long, right? And people kind of balk at that idea. But that's not what our data show. Now, having studied thousands of classrooms, thousands of organizations, we've seen that these cultures of growth are actually way more rigorous. So we did this study with this entire university faculty and more than 15,000 students, all these STEM professors in these Gateway STEM courses. And we asked these 15,000 students in these classes, knowing what their faculty's mindset and mindset practices were, we said, how do you experience these classes? And they said, these are the classes, we looked at the course evaluations, these are the classes that inspired me to do my best work. They're places where I had the most learning that I've had in my coursework. They responded that they saw them just as rigorous as the cultures of genius. So from students' own perspective, right, rigor is not something you trade off when it comes to the culture of growth. And in fact, from students' perspective, these cultures of growth are not always the most pleasant, right?
And everyone did better.
Absolutely, everyone does better. And the teacher is never satisfied with learning plateaus, which from students' perspective is kind of annoying, right? You're always having to learn, grow, and develop. And they're pushing students in this direction. The second way I think people really misunderstand cultures of growth, I think it comes from an overwhelm or burnout place, worried about hustle culture and grinding, right? You're asking me, I'm already overwhelmed and stressed. Students are recovering from the pandemic. Now you're asking me to change my teaching practices?
Yeah, overhaul
right?
my practices.
Exactly. Go jump into a lake, right? But the data actually suggests otherwise. We've studied this question empirically, and we find that teachers who engage in these practices see transformation in their students that make the teaching more enjoyable. Students are raising their hand. They come to office hours in college classrooms at unprecedented levels. They're engaged with the learning. They're asking questions, right, that they've never asked before. And in validated measures of burnout, teachers report in high school classes that they're less burnt out. And in some of the long-term studies that David Yeager and our colleagues have been leading, we are seeing that teachers are more willing to re-up, to come back and teach some of the most difficult courses in high school, which are these Algebra 1 courses that also offer college credit as a function of them. They're quite difficult to teach. Students don't always love taking them. And yet, when they started to teach them through the lens of the culture of growth, they were more likely to be willing to come up and do it again.
One thing that really amazed me, because I zoomed into one of the meetings of Mary's organization, nationwide college instructor organization. Many of the instructors, professors, who were the most skeptical and didn't want to do it, were now the most enthusiastic, and they were going around telling everyone, you better do this.
That's right. They said, I'm never going back. I'm never going back to the way that I did it before. That's right.
Another thing that stood out in your book was how you talked about why cultures of genius can be problematic for everyone, particularly problematic for students from structurally disadvantaged groups, but problematic for everyone.
That's right. So I think the data now are very clear on this point, that when you have one of these prove and perform, you either have it or you don't. You're smart or you're not, right? One of these fixed-minded cultures of genius, what does it do to everyone in the classroom? Now these folks are my competition, right? I'm afraid to lose my seat in the class, right? I'm afraid to not be seen as a genius or those who have it. I don't want to be seen as one who are in the group of the have-nots. And so this is bad for everybody's motivation, people's engagement, people's willingness to take intellectual risks or to collaborate with others. In these cultures of genius, collaborative projects are really seen as things students don't want to do. Why? Because how am I going to be seen as the star, as the one who has it, when we're working together? You only can tell what our team does and not what I do as an individual. We also saw effects on ethical behavior, cheating, cutting corners. You know, in the workplace, we see people leaving people off of the meeting invitations, Information hoarding, right? Because information is power. And in a culture of genius, I need to do everything I possibly can to hold on to my status, to hold on to my reputation that I am one of those who has it.
In that study, the people in the culture of growth said they were more committed to the organization. They were more trusting of it. They knew that if they took a really reasonable, smart risk, but it didn't work out, the organization would have their back. Maybe the only thing that was higher for the culture of genius was this report of cheating, cutting corners, stealing ideas, and this kind of toxic competition.
That's right. And I should mention, too, that these cultures of genius, they're also bad for those who are seen as the geniuses in the room, right? Because it almost puts a straitjacket on people. There's very little room for learning, growth, development, making mistakes. And if you are dethroned in these cultures of genius, you're nothing, right? It's black and white. You either have it or you don't. And then finally, I'll say that it's really important for structurally disadvantaged students. These cultures of genius are particularly bad because we know what the societal prototype of genius is. If you put genius into Google and you look at the Google images, who are you going to see? You're going to see Einstein. You're going to see Steve Jobs. You might see Elon Musk. Who don't you see? You don't see a lot of women. You don't see a lot of people of color. You don't see people with disabilities. And why does that matter in the education context? Because who we see as fitting this model of genius in these cultures of genius classrooms is who is going to get the teacher's energy, the resources, the mentorship, the sponsorship. True, too, in companies as well. And so these cultures of genius, they're bad for most people, and they're particularly bad for those of us who don't fit that model of who a genius is, what their background is, and what they look like.
Great, thank you. Okay, now suppose I'm an educator or a business leader sitting here today. I realize, I've been creating fixed mindset culture, or at least not consciously creating a growth mindset culture. What should I do now? What's the first thing I should do?
Well, I think the first thing people should do is read my book. But seriously, in the book, we talk a lot about these mindset triggers. Identifying our mindset triggers for ourselves and for the people we care for most, our kids, the people we interact with, our students, those we mentor and support. Understanding when we are likely to be triggered to our fixed mindset and when those students and others are likely to be triggered, and understanding then how to create contexts that move them more toward the growth mindset. That's how we start to create these microcultures of growth around us in every interaction that we have, that then can be creating these larger cultures of growth in classrooms, in our families, in our workplaces. I would say we need to start looking at everything through the lens of learning, right? So let's give a concrete example. When we praise people, what do we usually say?
What?
Good job. Good work.
It's over.
It's done. You did great, right? But that doesn't tell anybody, what did they actually do well? What do we want them to repeat in the future? Or how could they build on that success so the next time it's even more productive or successful? So even in these small interactions that we have, we can look at things through the lens of learning and figure out how to create contexts that really help move ourselves and others into their growth mindset.
Keep that momentum going.
That's right.
Mary, tell us, why did you write this book? And what's your biggest hope or dream for it?
Well, I think now that we've been looking at this question for the last 15 years, I have become deeply convinced that we are all culture creators. Regardless of our role, we can create these cultures around us. And I wrote the book because I felt we had enough knowledge at this point to help teachers, leaders, and anyone with the sphere of influence to have tangible, concrete strategies, stories, tools that they could use to create these cultures of growth, to identify the cultures of genius and to really change them into cultures of growth where they can be supported, productive, and joyful, and support everybody's thriving. I think what I've come to understand is that us in the West, we like to think that we're all individuals. We can do everything on our own. But I think the truth is that we do very little on our own. And I've come to believe that mindset is one of those things that we have to do together.
Yes.
And it has been one of the privileges of my life to do mindset with you.
Whoa. In turn, let me say what a privilege it has been to work with you. This is a life-changing book. And it doesn't just change the individual person, it changes everyone around them. I went into research to understand how we could help people fulfill their potential and why so many people were not fulfilling their potential. Mary's book, Cultures of Growth, is a huge part of the answer. And it's an actionable part of the answer. It tells people what to do about this, what they can do to fulfill their potential collaboratively.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to invite David to the stage now, and we'll do some Q&A.
All right. I have a question.
Okay.
So every once in a while, you hear this debate about standards. We saw this last year with Maitland Jones, the big controversy at NYU. So for people who don't know, organic chemistry professor, according to the simple version of the story, is run out of the room, fired by NYU for being too hard. And so the big narrative is Gen Z these days can't handle the tough, rigorous, demands of our society. But you look at the details, and it was a very fixed mindset culture. But what do you say to people who think culture of growth is just lowering standards or just catering to the people who just can't take the stress and demands of our modern culture?
Well, I think we have data on this question. So in the study with the entire university STEM faculty and the 15,000 students, we actually looked at this question of rigor, particularly in the courses where the materials, like Intro Bio 101, right? The same book, the same tests, just different instructors who have different mindsets. So the actual rigor of the course and the actual material that's being taught doesn't change. It's only whether the teacher is teaching through the lens of the growth mindset or through the lens of the fixed mindset. And we saw the impact on students' outcomes. We saw that students performed better in the courses, right? The same material, better in the courses when the instructors taught through the lens of the growth mindset. And the achievement gap, the racialized achievement gap in those courses were halved, lowered by 50%, which opens doorways. Those gateway classes actually then become opportunities for students to pursue these STEM pathways over time. We also saw students were much more willing and interested in recommending these courses to others. So if it's about Gen Z, did you say? Gen Z, saying, absolutely not, I can't do this, it's too stressful, we saw just the opposite in the data. Students were saying, this is the bio class to take. Take it with this person, not that person over there. So we were seeing the impact in that way too.
Yeah, one of your items, as I recall, was would you recommend this class to another student?
That's right, and that's where we saw the impact.
Yeah, I tend to agree that young people want to be held to high standards. They want to accomplish things, but they want to feel like there's an actual path.
Right.
Right, in a fixed mindset, there's a closed path. It's only for some, not all.
That's right.
This is a comment in the chat, another thing I hear a lot is, okay, but I'm really busy as an instructor. I have a lot going on. I'm catering to so many different people, so many different needs. How can I have the time to do all of this culture of growth stuff, to take the perspective of somebody else, and is that even possible?
Yeah. Well, it's why we've created our Culture of Growth programs to really focus on the kinds of things teachers are going to have to do anyway. You're going to have to give a first day of class speech describing what the course is about, describing how we're going to interact with each other in the classroom. In K-12, we're going to talk about student rules and how we actually create the rules, co-create the rules together, our standards for interaction. We're going to have to do that. Why not do it through the lens of the growth mindset? And so we give strategies and tools for things teachers are already going to have to do. They're going to have to give grades. They're going to have to give feedback. They're going to have to call on students. They're going to have to introduce difficult material that they know year after year students are going to struggle with. How do we do that in a way that's going to trigger our students more towards their growth mindset instead of immediately pushing them to their fixed mindset? Those are the practices we focus on, and by doing so, that's where we see transformative impacts on student motivation and performance.
Yeah, and I think there's something that's really profound about your work is how it solves the core frustrations so many educators have. And that frustration is, I'm teaching, students aren't listening, they're not responding, I have to direct and tell. But in a culture of growth, as you describe it, students seek out the challenges, they ask for help, right?
That's right.
They're being proactive. So you're saving time on the back end.
And again, as Mary reported before, when you ask, how often do you think you shouldn't be in teaching? The teachers who have been through this short program are more committed to teaching, less thinking they should not be there. They can't hack it.
That's right.
They don't want to be burdened like this anymore.
That's right. And in this moment post-pandemic where, it's really hard for teachers right now. And we see turnover, and districts can't keep teachers in the classroom. This is a way that we think we can help support teachers, creating a culture of growth around teachers to help support them so that they in turn can create these cultures of growth for their students in their class.
Yeah, one of the big things is creating teacher cultures, teacher support groups. Exactly. Where they trade what has worked best for them and how they've implemented it.
The practices, yeah.
So here's a good one. We've probably heard a version of this question for 15, 20 years collectively. Grades. So on the one hand, grades could be viewed as the bad guy. Because if you're like telling a student that they're not smart, they can't cut it, you failed, right? You get an F. So there's a version of interpreting this where you say we should get rid of grades. But there's another side to it as well. Where do you kind of fall on this? And you could even generalize it too in the organization setting. Bonuses, like financial rewards, like performance evaluations. Should we get rid of all summative evaluation if we want a culture of growth, or would you do something different?
Well, grades can take account of progress. Kids can be given chances to revise their work and get credit. Students will be proud of the grades that they get because they reflect progress. Some people have asked me, should we just grade on effort? No. What about the student who looks like they're working hard, but they're not getting anywhere? That's not an A. Why you wouldn't use a growth mindset to support non-learning? What is this student not understanding? How can we help them to get back on track? How can we help them make their effort effective?
That's right. I think people need feedback. to know exactly where they are in the moment. The question is, how is that feedback framed? There's ways to give feedback. Critical feedback is one of people's most popular fixed mindset trigger. You give me feedback, negative feedback, maybe feedback I didn't even ask for. You give me some feedback, and suddenly I'm feeling like it's a pronouncement on myself, right? I'm a bad person. I might not be smart enough. I might not have what it takes. But there's ways to structure that feedback that actually helps people understand this is a moment in time. It's here to help us understand how we as teachers can help you improve, grow, and develop. Here are some resources, some strategies we can think about together so that the next time we can see some improvement in our learning, right? And it works the same way in organizations and cultures where people need feedback over time, but there's ways to structure that feedback. There's ways to incentivize the kinds of growth-minded interactions, collaboration, innovation, taking risks, making mistakes, but learning from them. And if we build that into our incentive systems, we're gonna create cultures of growth that everyone can benefit from and thrive in.
Yeah, and I think one part of your book I liked, and I encourage everyone to read it, is your review of the Gates, not the Gates Foundation. I was going to apologize to the Gates Foundation people because there's a section on Microsoft under Ballmer, which had a very fixed mindset culture, and the performance was worse. That gives you Zune and Bing, right? Mm-hmm. And then under Satya Nadella, then you have a culture of growth.
That's
and then
right.
you have great products.
Cloud computing.
Top market cap.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
But they don't get that by having fake, phony benchmarks.
No.
Right? There's real standards, real accomplishment, but in the context of a culture of growth.
That's right.
David, I see a question here I'd like to answer.
Great.
How can non-decision makers help influence a culture of growth in an organization? I was asked by a unit within a very large Silicon Valley organization that I will not name yet.
Yet. The threat is real.
They were super intimidated by all the geniuses, and they were afraid when they submitted their work to the CEO. They were always thinking, what will Steve say? And they felt this was really cramping their creativity to a large extent. We talked about a lot of things, and one thing they really resonated to was this. Starting every meeting with everyone going around the room saying, what are you struggling with? Mm. And it was liberating. People couldn't believe that other people struggled with things. And what started happening was another person would say, I'm struggling with that too. Maybe we can work together. Or I used to struggle with that. Here are some things that helped me. Let's meet afterwards and I'll tell you about them. So it became they demystified the whole thing. They de-geniusified the whole thing. And it became a very lively and productive unit.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I also think another thing folks who may not have institutional or organizational power might be able to do is to start to create and find your culture of growth pod. That might be another teacher down the hallway where you two start to talk about how you're going to implement some of these things together. You give each other feedback. It might be people outside of your school or outside of your own organization where you're actually working together to help support each other, brainstorm when a challenge comes up, right? How would we crowdsource some ideas to overcome that challenge? When we do this in community, we can have a much bigger impact for our own selves, but also for those that we interact with on a day-to-day basis. And you don't have to have institutional power to do those sorts of things. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that, Mary, your book has so many examples of things anyone can do in their organization, but it also emphasizes if you are higher up, you're the chief of HR, et cetera, what are you doing in your policies to allow people to feel rewarded for having created those pods? Mm-hmm. Because people could eventually lose steam if it's like, well, all the fixed mindset culture people keep getting promotions and raises, then it's unfair. So I think your book, does an amazing job of the individual action, but also calling out people who control resources. Mm-hmm. So here's one about honors courses. But I want to Texify this. And for those non-Texans, if you are a Texan, your job is to make things as Texan as possible at all times. So this is not about barbecue, although we could go into depth if we wanted to. But so Texas passed a law in the latest legislature that I think is very good, that changed advanced math tracking from an opt-in policy to opt-out. So higher performing students are opted into advanced math that would end in calculus basically by the end of high school. And the reason that we think that that's good is because in the past, it's just wealthier parents basically who know the Algebra 1 by 8th grade track is where you want to go. So think about cultures of growth. How could a culture of growth interact with that kind of policy, right? On the one hand, you might think, oh, you're dividing kids into talented or not. On the other hand, if those places are great cultures of growth, they will retain more and more diverse students through the pipeline. So how do you think about the intersection of culture with advanced policies?
Yeah, I have a particular example that I got to know really well in the book. A leader by the name of Lou Wool, who inherited this district, Harrison Central School District, HCSD. And he was a new leader to the district, and it's located in Westchester, New York. And so on the outside, it looks like a very privileged environment, right? It looks like a place where many of the students are thriving. But he dug really deep into his own data, looking across the entire district, and he noticed that more than 25% of his students were on free and reduced lunch. And almost with 100% accuracy, he could predict, based on the student's zip code, whether they would end up in Algebra 1 by the time they were in 8th grade, whether they'd end up with what was called a Regents diploma, a college-ready diploma, by the end of their schooling coming through his district, all of the schooling that happens. And he noticed that a lot of these wealthy districts had not only the latest technology, and of course textbooks, but those districts that were less affluent, they didn't even have enough textbooks to go around. Students were taking turns who would take the textbook home in the evening. And so he decided to make a change. And part of the change was the tracking system that you describe here in Texas. He got rid of this kind of tracking, but he didn't do it all at once. He sort of focused on thinking about how to redistribute some of the funds from one set of schools to others, which really upset a lot of the parents, wondering whether or not making these classes available to everybody was going to dumb down, right, reduce the rigor of these courses, make them less exclusive. And yet they found in the data that when they did this slowly, but providing incredible supports for the teachers, he changed the teacher evaluation system at the same time that he got rid of tracking, so that now the teachers were giving more supports for participating in these programs to be able to learn how to teach students from many different backgrounds with different sets of knowledge coming into the courses. How do you do that effectively? He created these cultures of growth around his own teachers so that they then could create these cultures of growth in these more diverse classes that they found themselves in when they got rid of tracking. And ultimately what they found was that the racialized achievement gaps at the end of each one of these, end of elementary school, end of middle school, end of high school, were reduced to statistically zero. And that effect has held now for more than 15 years. So transforming these classrooms in this way is possible, but you can't just do it just by simply getting rid of sort of tracking. You have to provide that kind of culture of growth, that support for the teachers who are going to be implementing this change on the ground.
Yeah, you know, that's amazing. There's a classic finding in education that, going back to the high school and beyond data set, Roger Schaus's analysis, that the schools that narrow achievement disparities the most are the combination of super high standards and super high support.
Super high support.
But for a long time, they didn't know what it was about those schools. Is it their course tracking? Is it this or that? I think culture of growth starts giving people a vocabulary for figuring out what has been kind of sitting there under our noses all along. Carol, I know a secret about you.
Uh-oh.
The secret is that you became a neuroscientist recently.
Oh,
you
yes.
secretly published a paper in Psych Review. Yeah. We have a question about neuroscience. I'm just very briefly, what have you learned? The other secret, this is for the follow-up presentation, we'll tell the other secrets about you. What have you learned about the prefrontal and the emotions and in the new research you've been doing?
Well, this was a theoretical paper. We reviewed the entire literature on the functions of the prefrontal cortex versus the more motivational parts of the brain that have always been considered lower, of lesser importance in learning and intelligence. And the literature suggests, and now we're testing it in a rigorous neuroscience study, that these so-called lower motivational parts of the brain are in close partnership with the prefrontal cortex, usually considered the smart part of the brain, and are often telling it what to do, setting the goals, and then the prefrontal cortex figures out the strategies. But it's a collaborative endeavor. So I'm really excited, really pursuing this with the most rigorous studies to give mindset, motivation, its rightful place in the intelligence hierarchy.
Yes.
Great. Mary, to take us home, what are your hopes and aspirations for Cultures of Growth? What happens in the perfect world after this book is released to the world?
When we create cultures of growth together, we are going to create environments where we are inspired to do our best work, when we are engaged, where we trust each other, we collaborate, we innovate, and we have equity in the world. We have these contexts where good ideas come from everywhere, and everyone has the opportunity to rise because they're supported and they're learning, they're growing. And that's the world I want to live in. It's the world I hope you want to live in. And I think it's the world that we'll create together by creating these cultures of growth.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Mary Murphy, Carol Dweck.